Hi everyone, my name is Bailey Peryman and welcome to another session of Farmer in the Field. Today we are in Auckland at Sarah Smuts-Kennedy's research garden, Maunga Kereru, and Sarah's going to be taking us on a tour of that today. You'll know Sarah, she has been on the other side of the camera hosting these Farmer in the Field sessions as a mentor, and this time we're in Sarah's world in her own garden, so it's going to be lots of fun as always. And joining us this week on the mentoring side, we have Levi from OMG, who will be supporting us. And so welcome everyone. And Levi, do you want to say a quick g'day and introduce yourself to the viewers?
Kia ora people. Yeah, I'm Levi. Really stoked to be here, and it's awesome to be mentoring you, Sarah, because you've done a lot of mentoring of me.
It's not. I agree. It's very nice.
Yeah.
Hi everybody. I'm back again this week, so it'd be really cool. My name's Daniel Schuurman. I'll be really cool to have a look to see what Sarah's been doing in her garden of late. Obviously, plenty of challenges without lots of rainfall in Auckland. So, Sarah, if you want to take it away and introduce yourself again as a gardener in your garden and show us around.
Thanks, guys. And Daniel and Levi, you've both been to my garden. In fact, Levi has helped me for many years before he got too busy at OMG here. So you know it intimately. So I think that's going to be really helpful, Levi. And I'm really excited, Bailey, to be able to show you my garden, because I don't think you've ever been here. So, and everyone else, it's not a farm in the same way that many of you are actually attempting to start a farm. It really functions as part of my artwork. As an artist, I started my inquiry around permaculture, which led me into biodynamics, and through the biodynamic inquiry, I became really interested in synthropic systems thinking. And synthropy and entropy are the sort of, if you think of an infinity sign, it's they're kind of like the balance between a death impulse and a life impulse. And biodynamics works like with the vortex, which is a synthropic system. And so for the love of bees, and arrived out of my inquiry into what synthropic systems thinking meant at a community scale, but obviously I have to practice it with plants and biology, and actually have been testing it for 10 years here. On an engineered clay driveway is where we've placed our edible garden. It's about 400, would you say, Levi, it feels about like 400 square meters of that edible? Yeah, it feels about right. We're starting down here where normally my cows are, but like Daniel said, we've had a lot of drought. We only catch off our roof, and we don't have massive capacity. And so halfway through the season, I literally had to just stop watering everything apart from what was literally feeding us. So I'm in the process of recovering garden beds at the moment. I hope to have a well next summer, so that will make things different. But having said that, there were also quite a number of garden beds that have really slowed down. And so I'm really, obviously the last month with the masterclasses, I think I've got my head around thinking about that, but I'd really like to show you guys and get some feedback on that. I'm holding this myself because I'm alone at home. So there'll be a little bit of finger in there. But also, I'm really interested, Daniel, around, because I use a lot of cow manure, because I've got 2 cows. And in fact, I'm standing in amongst my cow pats, you can see, on my front lawn, permaculture, and that they're right there. I don't have to travel too far to get them. But I'm kind of interested in, everyone else who's been making compost for 10 years, like I have got, high nutrition, but they've been using a lot of food scraps. I don't use so many food scraps, but I'm interested in you know, what's the implications of cow manure in my processes, and also strategies for how I can start to think more around future-proofing this place in regards to wind and I have a husband who's not so much into permaculture, so I've never been able to plant a windbreak. So it's about working with what you've got, and I have almost a willing collaborator on my site, but not 100%. So I haven't got windbreaks in place, and we have argued about how far away fruit trees should be from each other. But yeah, anyway, you're going to get to see where we are. I'll start. We've got three different kinds of garden bed strategies, because I wanted it to be a bit of a teaching space. So we have your traditional raised garden beds. You see we've got lots of volunteers. The green there is all parsley seedlings which are coming up. So we do a lot of volunteer growing, but these are, I was so busy with our project that I didn't, sorry, it's going to be a bit weird. Can you see, guys?
Yep,
that's good.
fine. That's good.
Okay, cool. So you can see for the COVID, I actually hadn't grown as many seedlings as I needed to, so I had to buy some in. But and these garden beds had been a bit slow. I'm not a fan anymore of the raised garden bed, but I have them because I sort of feel like integrating garden beds into the ground is kind of going to give me more resilience. Having said that, these are waking up quite well. You see, I've got lots of rosemary. It's a home garden, but it is a home garden that produces about 90% of all of our vegetables. These are, I don't know if you can see very well, but you know, we've got lettuces and carrots, and I use the parsley as a way to keep my soil systems alive. So the root systems are always in there. Here we go. Parsley path. Oh, are you there?
We've lost your video feed.
Oh, hang on. Okay, hang on. Hang on.
Yep.
Sorry, we also have really weird Wi-Fi in the country. But we were talking a bit before we started about green paths, and that's my parsley path. So can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Asparagus. Then we're moving up to another layer. More, these are sort of more traditional garden beds. These, so I don't till these anymore. I did for ages. And I stopped doing that about 3 years ago, and they're really just starting to come back. These had tomatoes in them. The parsley was in, and the basil was in there underneath them. I kept them in to keep the soil microbiology fed. I'm now harvesting them, so I'm harvesting them for our cows. You can see here rabbits. So unless we, in fact, here's a classic rabbit moment. Parsley under a net, parsley completely nuked. Here I am using carrots as a cover crop, and this is what I planted sort of in a rush to get seedlings for. The moon was right, and we've got so much seed, it's not an issue. But they're seriously, it's sort of like cover cropping as opposed to probably planting, but that's carrots, beetroots, carrots, leeks, chards, beans, shallots on the outside. But I'm transplanting those now, apart from that, and I'm harvesting some of them as salads. But here's a garden bed that, you know, doesn't get the same kind of treatment, and it was re-established this year. And, you know, I've got seeds in here, but they're being eaten by quail. But we've got perennials in there. The artichokes, tarragon, for example, doesn't get watered, survives really well. Artichokes didn't get watered, survived very well. Hollyhocks survived. Calendula managed to survive. So it's about getting the balance there. Flax is around the outside, really good for pests and stuff. Here's a garden bed that is, you know, doesn't really get too much. It's got blueberries in it. I was told that blueberries liked an acidic content, but substrate, but that, you said to me recently, Daniel, that actually they can just survive in it. So I'm really thinking that this whole garden bed needs a complete, it's sort of been neglected.
Blueberries, when you talked about that, they like acidity, is that there's what we call them now basically acid tolerant.
Yeah.
Although interesting enough, blueberries are I think are a species that don't they deal with different groups of fungi, so they have a very, very different root system to most plants.
How would you, so I haven't really been putting compost onto this space because, I mean, a little bit, but not really a lot. I've used, obviously, the oreganomas in there, and they always start the season looking really fantastic. And then as the season comes on, and this time they've actually literally run, we didn't have water to water them. But similarly with my berries, I have to say, and I give them heaps of compost, and I just don't feel like my berries are not, not giving me the joy that I would like, that's for sure. So potentially this is where I put my compost.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes those berry crops really do like a lot of water, and if you don't give them the water that they need, or they're not getting the water that they need, they'll just abort the fruit. So, they start off looking good because they're started with wet, early in the season, but as it dries out in your clay soils, it's underneath there. If they root down into that, it's not generally sort of conditions that they're particularly fond of without that water. What's the tree in the background there? Is that Tamarillo?
Yeah, so I've got in here 3 different guavas, tamarillos, peaches, pear. I mean, there are plums on this side. And underneath it, we did kumara this year. We had a really good kumara crop here last year, but this year, I think we just used we used a tipu that came from an online source. They didn't come in fantastic condition. We tried to revive them.
They don't revive very well.
No, I think that was a really bad.
When my experience with them is when the tipu go off, like start getting wilty and all the rest of it, they really don't recover very well. Yeah. I don't know what other people find, but they're pretty touchy like that.
But also we used a whole lot of mulch, basically weeds that had been sitting in a pile for 2 or 3 years. And it was a soil of sorts, but it wasn't really complex. And we used that as the kind of way to mound them. And again, I think that was a mistake. But we did the same with our potatoes this year. So we grew, there are new potatoes coming up in there, but we grew an amazing crop of potatoes this year under our orange trees. And I coated them in what I would normally do as a tree paste. So ash and poo and sand and probably a few other things, CPP. And then I dug up these are paths that we've had mulch on for forever. That's probably all gone now because we put it on the potatoes. But we had an amazing crop. But the result is that now there's been even no weeds have grown in it. And I just think, again, it was just too heavy in carbon. I'll keep doing the tour.
You mentioned CPP, Sarah. Do you have any pits in the garden?
Yes,
do you want to explain a little more for the viewers what CPP is?
Yeah, and I did a post on that earlier this week in the Insta takeover. So just here's the orchard. So those are heirloom nectarine trees grown from seeds given to me by my stepmother, black boy peach, persimmon, pomegranates looking amazing. Just get incredible pomegranates. That's our Jerusalem artichoke area. You can see here we've got a lot of volunteer leeks, which are coming up but being eaten by rabbits. This here, nothing seems to survive the rabbits, but also I think the condition of the soil. We have peaches, lots of figs, limes. We actually have a lime that basic 10 years, and now, even though we've been trying to liquid feed it, it's really on the turn. An ugly fruit, peaches, pears, more nectarines, mandarins.
Sarah, I think you might
Fiji
actually move a bit
is more
far away from
lemonade.
You might
Too
be at
far
your
away?
limit there. You're
Am I
getting a
back
bit
in?
patchy, yeah.
Yeah, you need to go back a bit closer to your Wi-Fi connection, I think.
Okay.
Because
So no,
we're
I can't
starting to
show
lose
you the cow
quality.
pet pit, but you can go on and have a look on my Instagram takeover. But
Cool.
yes, what I'll do actually, I'll show it to you from here. Can you see in the corner down there?
What are we looking for?
It's my
No.
CPP pitch. But yes, I make 2 batches of CPP a year, and it's cow pet pit, and it's basically basalt rock, eggshells, and biodynamic preps. I didn't have basalt or preps during COVID, so I just used Agnihotra ash, and everything is powdered. But I still get a really beautiful material, and it's fermented. So essentially, it's in a pit in the ground for about half a year. It varies depending on your ecosystem, how long it takes. But when it's ready, it turns into this absolutely beautiful, crumbly material that stores extremely well, and it's you can just see life crawling through it. It's a wonderful material, I think of it as a microbial inoculant, fermented one. So from the garden here, you're seeing essentially what I've done is on the hillside, I'm using fruit trees. I really want to, I have had arguments about how far fruit trees should be apart, but I'm really going to, I wish I'd planted them all at once during the synthropic way, but we use a lot of artichokes, we've got a lot of geraniums, and we use hollyhocks and nasturtiums, and it's very rare for it to be so bare. Normally, the plant life is sort of up to my mid-thigh, but in this weather, things have just sort of died off. But every excess seed that we have goes into that environment, and so they will pop up. But it's been like, I haven't composted that area. It's been literally just a slow build of using biomass that comes from there back onto there to try and kind of invigorate that, because I haven't been able to make enough compost. But also everywhere where we've been was kikuya, and so we've actually got rid of the kikuya through cardboard and mulch. But I was talking to Daniel and Levi, and I think that we might take to growing clover here just to help the paths become more pest resistant. And then these here are sort of the garden beds are about 1, 2, 3 meters long and about a meter wide. And I've got 12 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them. Sorry, 9. So 9 of these kinds of beds. And I love these garden beds. And I never let them be bereft of a root system. And they've basically been many seasons now of like sunflowers, and then the roots get left in, and then something just goes in beside it. And they are, although the one at the end is not quite as good at the others, and you can see rabbits again. So in here we've got quite a lot of multi-species planting, but chards, beetroots, peas, mustard, really close together. I'm going to start to actually terminate some of this mustard in here, leaving the roots in. And then we have an area down here, and this is normally where I've been growing shallots and potatoes and amongst the fruit trees. But you can see the soil system is just, it's just super dry. But all of this is on compacted engineered clay, and we would have bought maybe 2 or 3 lots of compost in 10 years. Most of it's been grown by us. So can you kind of get a sense of it? It's quite self-contained. And the rest of the plantings that we've done are native. So you can kind of see it was a paddock, so everything that you can see we've planted, and sadly I don't think the Wi-Fi is going to let me go up to our composting area, which is quite a big area at the top where we make all of our compost, but again you can see that on so there you go, that's my tour.
Thank you very much. So that's a lot to manage. My first sense that you've already pointed out you're doing a fair bit of it yourself. I've just got a question straight off the bat of how you find that, how you find a busy work life as well, and having that garden there.
So everything is designed for ease, hence why it's really self-contained. It's been a massive amount of work to get to here. We're 10 years in now. There have been times where I've had a lot of woofers here to do some of that kind of, really hardcore stuff, but not a lot really. If you look at it, maybe 3 months over 10 years, that's not really a lot. I had Levi for a couple of years would come and help me a couple of days a year, which was really, really helpful as I've become super busy. So essentially I do work pretty much full-time plus on For the Love of Bees and my art practice, but I can actually produce enough food and keep the soil system. Generally, if I hadn't had drought, that's sort of a big setback, and I will, starting again, and also the bunnies. If it wasn't for the bunnies and the quail, we'd be a lot further down the track, but I've lost lots of seedlings. They love to pick at the fresh seedlings. Then I can do it on sort of a day a week in a way. But probably I'm lying to myself about that, but that's what it kind of feels like. And I use a lot of volunteers. So for example, I let lots of things go to seed and then I transplant them. So I haven't really grown any leek seedlings for years. I've just done some now, but I wouldn't normally do that. I have to say fruit trees are amazing. That's the next big job for us, is we do tree pastes and we're pruning our trees, and that is a really big job. We probably have about 80 fruit trees and they all get tree pastes every year. They don't get pruned necessarily every year, but it's a joy. It is a joy.
And I can relate to the idea of your garden being a research kind of space too. I have done that at home. And what do you think are some of the really breakthrough things? Anything that's been like a real breakthrough for you that you found and taken out of the space and shared it wider?
Oh yeah, look, I just remember that first year where I watched a tomato plant in my asparagus bed just go crazy. No disease, no pest pressure. When I'm like lovingly tending the garden beds that I've prepared and I've put new stuff and I've turned them and all the rest of it, and going something is doing its stuff all by itself. So that was that no-till moment for me. That happened way before the no-till conversation, where I didn't really understand it. I couldn't make logic of it because I'd been taught another way, and I trusted that way. But that was really amazing. I'm also really interested as an artist. I'm really interested in resonance. I did a project with kauri trees where I did an agnihotra process, and I divined a particular, it's a bit kooky for a lot of people, but that's why I'm an artist, where I took CPP and ash in a certain time and a certain moon, and I did it in a crystal, Vortex did it in a crystal singing bowl, and I did it with beetroot. And I was away, I was on the other side of the city, and so I did about 24 seedlings, and I transplanted them when I came back to my property. And of those 24 seedlings, about 20 of them grew to be like, seriously, they were massive. And also they were really drippy. So there was like a huge amount of moisture. I remember eating them and staining my shirt from eating this huge, massive beetroot. So those are the kind of really interesting things where I go, there's more going on here than we understand. And I guess the big thing for me is, as I've been learning with Daniel for the last, well, since 2016, just understanding how the natural system works and reducing my workload, producing, I mean, honestly, we produce so much food. And as Levi will attest, it's very tasty. He, the other day, was like, oh, your parsley is so sweet. So the sweetness of our food is really extraordinary. And mostly we get into a rhythm where it's looking after itself. So are they breakthroughs? I think they are. They're simple. They're simple. They're so simple they shouldn't be a breakthrough, but they actually are a breakthrough, I think.
You were talking earlier about the use of cow manure, and potentially looking at, I guess, the use of cow manure in composting versus food scraps, and then also cow manure potentially being used, I guess, in the garden beds where you've got sort of all this massive carbon, try and help the fungi to break it down. And my comment sort of started off with, well, and what we're seeing with all the garden beds, we've got this massive amount of organic matter, is we also got generally a huge amount of nutrition, and it's all sort of overkill. And so putting, cow manure into that doesn't necessarily feel like the right thing to do. But having said that, there is a difference between that, trying to get a growing bed up and running versus composting. And so when you're actually putting a compost pile together, introducing, a source of nitrogen, essential green material in the form of cow manure, of course, brings a huge number of inoculums with it. And you're sort of really dealing with something that's like a pre-digested. It's like taking food and putting it through, the sort of bokashi process, the digestion process, and composting it. Cows, obviously, the ruminant gut, it's an anaerobic composting machine, really. So you do get a lot of benefits by using that in a compost. And but yeah, differentiating, trying to get the understanding between what you're doing in a compost pile versus what you're doing in a garden bed are actually two different systems.
Yeah, right.
The compost system is a biological system in itself that's breaking, that's basically turning that organic matter into soil. Where you're dealing with a garden bed where you've already got a soil system, and all that organisms are present, is that by overloading that system, it's the same as sort of, I guess, messing up a compost recipe. If you get the compost recipe, it doesn't work. If you get the compost recipe wrong, as in too much carbon, not enough nitrogen, and not a really good inoculum source, you're using a little bit of really good, you usually use a little bit of the old compost pile and the new compost pile as inoculum?
Yeah, totally. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right, we just lost your video again. I sometimes wonder how often that gets forgotten, little things like that. When you're making up a compost pile, how often people actually remember to put in, actually in the new compost pile, some old compost, or some of the previous compost, it's inoculation, especially not so much maybe when you're using cow manure because of the degree of life that's there, but it certainly probably is in the case of a lot of food scraps that come out of the average household, having come out of systems that are pretty sterile and being cooked and put in there. They're often going into this composting, and they're introducing nutrition, obviously, but often not a great deal in the way of any sort of inoculum, certainly. So that becomes much more important in those systems, and I think often those things get forgotten.
I use a huge amount of compost in my new piles as an inoculum, and I've found that it speeds up the composting process by a month.
Will do make a massive difference, and also having a little bit of clay in there, and those sorts of ingredients all make a much better compost. The interesting thing, I was following something from the Soil Food Web the other day that was talking about a restoration project, and they ended up sourcing compost from think 6 or 8 different composting facilities. It was in New York, and because every compost brought together with it kind of a different, different inoculums and different nutrition profiles, and they wanted the greatest amount of biodiversity. And so it wasn't just like thinking of compost in terms of, well, we've got some compost, we'll pile it on. They were actually getting much more involved and looking at all the different sources. And it wasn't a case of looking for the best compost as much as many different sorts of compost as they could find from different processes to bring that biodiversity in. So that was quite an interesting thought that probably many people don't consider, is that, in a bigger project, the biodiversity sources of compost from different places potentially brings benefits into this, into gardening and the growing as well.
I wondered too, I mean, we don't talk a lot about biodynamics because we're really focused on, a lot of people aren't open to those kind of processes. And we talk a lot about biological systems, but the ferments that come from the biodynamics, I just wonder, I've been thinking more about the practical aspects of how the fermentation processes in biodynamics are introducing, and they're in micro quantities, but they don't need to be in macro quantities, do they, Daniel?
No, you're often inoculums that you need in these systems often are tiny amounts. The biggest thing often is more the fact that their distribution, you need to the distribution of them into your garden needs to be very general. So using very, very small amounts of inoculum, it's about how it's distributed around, either through the compost pile, and same as we were talking about inoculating compost again the other day, and as if you sort of put your pile together and then put the inoculum on the top, and hopefully that'll be all right. It's the big difference between putting inoculum in as you build it. It's getting contact, and that speeds the process up. And a lot of those, I mean, you're talking about, there's all sorts of different brewing processes that you're talking about with those various different preps, and some of them take 6 months to actually brew up and do their thing. Other things are much faster. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, we're just not generally that patient. I think the idea of putting something down and waiting 6 months for it to be ready is just, my experience is we're sort of too impatient for that. I think more than anything else, it's not that they don't work, it's just and it didn't want it now. It's like everybody wanted to build COVID-19 came along, all of a sudden, food security was an issue. So everybody went mad. Oh, I need a vegetable garden. Probably many of those people, which is great, probably haven't grown vegetables for many, many years, have ever. I suddenly woke up to the fact that they're the greatest thing they can do for their own health and security for their family is grow their own food, or grow at least some of their own food. But everybody wanted firstly, all the seedlings disappeared, so they wanted to plant it now and get it done quickly. I guess that's a timing thing. We're looking at compost piles in the background there, I see.
Yes, so this is my composting area. So I have quite a big area. I basically take weeds from the native areas where we're weeding. They sit there forever. I don't want to go too far because I lose my Wi-Fi capacity, but a big pile of cow manure there. And then essentially what I'm mostly doing is I'm harvesting tansy, comfrey, lawn clippings. I have an area further down where I've got my food scraps.
Yep, we're losing it.
And tea, actually using green from the property. So, okay, cool. Am I back?
You are now.
Okay, cool. So anyway, that's where we make compost. Having said that, Daniel, I am thinking about starting to build composts in situ. For example, here where under these trees, for example, where it's not looking so great, I'm thinking that I might build a compost there under the trees over the winter, and then it will be there ready for my kumara, and I won't have to move it very far, that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I mean, huge benefits out of all the leachates and the humic acid and stuff that comes out of the bottom of those compost piles. And, you know, as we've seen people like Sheldon from Kai Cycle, when they looked at what was underneath their composting area versus what was next to it, you know, the total change from the clay just to basically pure humus, humic, topsoil underneath it.
That was one of the first things I noticed. That would be my first breakthrough, actually, Bailey, is that when I first did my first biodynamic composts, the growth in them was just extraordinary. But also, because this is on an engineered clay hill, I could actually see how much soil literally underneath the compost had been built in such a short space of time. And I could actually take it from centimetres out from that to see where it stopped, where the influence had actually stopped. So the building of a compost and that's actually where my lime trees and my, cowpat pit is now, is that was just a radical change in substrate condition after having built 2 or 3 composts in that area for a time. So the original sort of 4 or 5 first years were about building those composts around. Now when we do them up there, every year I have to basically fight the fig trees back who, they send out roots into that compost. And because we leave them there so long, literally at the end of the process, we are pulling compost up around fig tree roots. Yeah. So this is, I would love your opinion, Daniel, on 2 things. The garden beds under my fruit trees. So it's been a dream of mine that, these garden beds have been vegetable beds before they had trees in them. And we do tend to still grow. We had aubergines in here last year and zucchini here the year before. I tend to do those bigger things in here. And I put grass clippings down here, which really did invigorate it. But then, can you see the condition of the soil? It's crumbly, but I sadly, when I first started doing this garden, I saw this amazing YouTube video with this guy had done a pile of mulch, a huge pile, and inoculated it. And then he showed the growth of the plants. So I'm like, oh, great. I'm just going to put all this mulch down. And I think that the carbon content of these has just never come right. So can you see?
Yeah, obviously it's dry, but the other thing is that it's very dark. So you've got a lot of humus in that soil to get that sort of color. It's hard to tell. I suspect what you get when it dries out is the tree. What you find with trees is you got lots of surface rooting, and they just go looking for moisture everywhere.
Yeah.
So you do need to have things growing in there. I think to keep that soil actually functioning, you still have to have you have to have plants in underneath those trees. In nature, a tree doesn't sort of exist in a system like that. And if you can get things like mycorrhizal fungi to function properly, they should even actually help move exudates from the upper story of the plants that are getting most of the light down to plants that are lower down if the network actually works properly. So I wouldn't hesitate. One of the things you could do is just find various different crops that thrive in the initial stages underneath there. I see you got some comfrey in the background, and no doubt that'll grow like crazy if you put it underneath the tree as well. The problem is that then getting something else to grow in there, so you need more diversity than just say putting a cover crop of comfrey.
Normally these do have plants underneath them. So for the last 7 to 8 years, they go through broad beans. So normally what would happen now is that the broad beans go in if they aren't being eaten by bunnies. There's parsley, there's lettuce, there's leeks, there's this yakoni thing. But what I'm finding at the moment is that they're just slowing down. So something in there's obviously there's been no water, which hasn't helped, but they're not as dynamic as they have been in the past at the moment. To be fair, the broad beans over there last year, were as high as me. So I'm probably being a little tough on them. But over the summer, well, you see, I have mulched with them, and they haven't, you know, this is broad beans from last year.
Yeah, so what you're seeing there is typical when you've got a carbon to nitrogen imbalance. So
Right.
what you're looking at, what you're steering at basically is carbon. And as I was saying earlier, when you look at things like wood chip, you've got a carbon to nitrogen ratio of like 300 to 1 up to 500 to 1. And although that is ideal food for fungi, the thing is, I was saying, like fungi only have a carbon nitrogen ratio of 10 to 1, 20 to 1. So you can see that the fungi can't process that and turn it into more. Fungi, as they're designed to do, as food, unless they can actually get some form of nitrogen source functioning. And when it really starts to dry out, you really start to run into problems with the nitrogen cycle starting to really, really slow down. So they slow down when it gets colder, they slow down when it gets drier, they speed up when it gets warm and wetter. You know, there's all sorts of things happening, but when you start looking at crop residue, which is what you're looking at there from last year's crop, that's still there the following year. Yes, a lack of moisture will slow it down, but the fact is it should have long gone before you ran out of moisture, and that's a case of, so I mean the old way of doing things would have been, oh, we'll throw a whole lot of nitrogen on the ground, you know, and we'll start feeding it up. But basically what we need to do is fix up one obviously we need some moisture to work with, but as soon as you've got that moisture, is getting crops growing in that ground. And I would start with legumes, because they're the best thing to repair soils.
So I'm wondering whether, for example, I might go crazy with 3 or 4 different varieties of clover and actually transition all of my paths into clover, and including under the garden beds, and then plant in amongst that. Do you think that could be a strategy?
Yep. I mean, there are commercial cropping situations at the moment where they're direct drilling things like, you know, maize into clover pastures. A range of different clover, again, is what we're looking for. Don't look for a single species of white clover. You need a range of, but you also add the legumes. Really, what you're looking for. So there'll be all sorts of different, I mean, in Auckland, there's a whole range of legumes that'll grow right through the year, mostly. But at this time of year, I would be starting to try in Auckland grow peas, because this is the only time it's get cold enough that you could actually successfully grow peas. Most of the time it's too warm.
I've got peas growing, but in my garden beds. And I guess that's the other thing I'm starting to think about. If I've only got 9 garden beds like this, which are more traditional, I have raised garden beds, I've got about 9 of those, then I'm looking to use these garden beds in a different way, and actually trying to, as possibly can, up here under my plants. So my chards, my leeks, my, you know, potentially my broad beans, my peas. So I'm freeing up those other garden beds for other types of crops.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably, I don't know what the other guys think, but I would probably look at those garden beds as things that you need to more go out and that are being picked almost every day, versus stuff that, you know, that's longer, slower cycles, like peas and broad beans and other bits and pieces like that need plenty of room. But all sorts of crops you can grow quite well in those. Those garden beds, the raised beds look really good when they're, you know, massively densely planted. I'm never concerned about excessive density, you know, plant density. More worried that when there's not enough there than when there's too much, so you can always thin them out. It's great.
Yeah, I'm really, and also they were slow. So they were going through the same issue of being slow. So that planting strategy of inoculating them and actually doing the density of planting has it really woken those garden beds up. So I'm feeling really happy with that. If I could just, I'm not a killer, so I'm finding it really hard to deal with rabbits. So yeah, I'm thinking about my big little farm breakthrough in regards to rabbits. I'm not quite sure what that is.
Just out of interest, I mean, I've just got some, interesting enough, I bought rabbit traps that are designed to go in a hole and it catches them live. So you could transport them off the site if you really wanted to. But at the same time that I
find
bought
their
load,
holes.
yeah, what's that? You can't find the holes?
No.
They'll be there.
Buggers.
They'll be there somewhere. But I just bought those at the same time that obviously a myxomatosis strain has come through, and we just have no rabbits anymore.
Oh, wow.
So now I've got a box full of traps that I didn't actually get to use. But
well, I'm looking forward to that moment happening up here. I mean, it is really wonderful. We have so many birds. We've got so many quail, and I've loved this week seeing the kotari turning up to OMG, and I do think that that's a wonderful thing. In the Maunga Kereru now, kotari, enough food to share. So there's a moment where it's really wonderful, and then there's a moment where it's a bit like, okay, enough already. That's enough.
That's where producing an overabundance is always fantastic, because then you can always allow some of it to be eaten.
Are there any other questions? How are we going for time, guys?
10 to 5.
We have another 10 minutes. Your questions. I'm just trying to remember. Was there a point about potentially higher levels of phosphorus coming through in the manure?
Yeah, that was a question. I'm really interested in knowing a little bit more about manure. What you did already was really fabulous. I knew that it's a major inoculant because of, it goes through the belly, it goes through 2 bellies, and there are different microbes in each of those bellies. But I wasn't aware of the phosphorus levels. And obviously we're learning that too much phosphorus slows fungi down. I guess this is the thing I'm really excited about at the moment, is I'm just thinking about everything through the microscope of what's going to make fungi happy. How can I get them in there? And that's my new aha moment. It's a really fun place to be thinking about eating from fungal networks. So I really am interested in terms of the phosphorus levels potentially in the cow manure. And obviously, like I used to put cow manure around my artichokes, or my rhubarb. And maybe that's not a good thing to do. Maybe I do have to put it through a composting process first.
I'm wondering what the first indicators then might be that there's starting to be a creeping accumulation of that.
Well, I guess if you look at the bigger picture, is that when you end up, when we explained in the first masterclass about the nutrient pools, it's really understanding when you're actually bringing an input like manure and where their phosphorus is, where that actually sits in the nutrient pool. So clearly it's not, when you bring manure in, it's essentially a soluble nutrient. And it's not that fungi don't like phosphorus. Fungi do need phosphorus, but when you have excess soluble phosphorus, the plant doesn't need to feed the fungi to actually mine the phosphorus out of the exchangeable pool and the parent material. All right, so, and phosphorus is interesting because it works, we call it like a spark plug. So it's actually really key to firing up. One of the things that when plants lack phosphorus, they can't build bricks. So phosphorus is incredibly important, but it's so powerful that it's very easy to overdo it in that soluble pool when we introduce it by skipping the microbial process and allowing that to happen, or that we overload that soluble pool. Sorry, Bailey, you asked me a specific question about
indicators of how we might notice.
Yep, I was getting to that. So when you look at, one of the tools you can use without a laboratory. So what we're talking about is visual assessment of the soil. A BSA it's called in commercial horticulture. So visual soil assessment is when you dig a hole, the first thing that we're looking to count is worms, right? Yeah. So at the moment, when it's dry worms, you can find dormant worms. You can find activity of worm activity is minimal. As you go deeper, you'll find them. But when it's nice and moist, if you still don't find worms, it's a really good sign that you're lacking fungi, because it's one of their key food sources. Worms also don't like lots of masses of soluble phosphorus. And when you dump lots of phosphorus in, not so much in the case of cow manure, but it's with conventional fertilizers, it's quite, they don't like it at all. It's a little bit like being put into a frying pan. So the first thing you're looking for is worms. If we've got lots of worms, generally we've got a pretty good, healthy biological system happening in the soil, because those worms are kind of the top of the poop loop, that nutrient cycle that we were talking about in the second class. So that's the first thing I look for if you're starting to look at how healthy soil is. But it is a bit more challenging when you've got really dry conditions.
Yeah, but I'm still thinking that, you know, like one of the ways in these dry conditions to kind of deal with kickstarting was, again, to bring in more compost. And I guess what I'm starting to think about is, you know, how do I wean myself off using compost quite so much?
Go cold turkey. You know, it's like giving up smoking or alcohol. Excessive consumption of something isn't good. So the excessive use of it. And when you put it on for years, the other thing is that having put it on like an engineered clay soil and thinking, well, you know, it's still not the perfect, you know, 10 years later, it's still not the perfect soil, and I've still got challenges and all the rest of it. Potentially, yes, the excess compost has now gone to the point where it's not being helpful, and you've got lots of carbon that hasn't actually broken down, and potentially possibly because it maybe wasn't composted, you know, as much or as far through the process, because the carbon to nitrogen ratio on the compost was maybe a bit carbon heavy, and then your soil becomes a bit heavy on this undigested carbon that we're trying to get to break down. So what you've seen is, rather than adding compost, is that if you can actually get plants growing en masse, which is what you've actually started to do with kind of a vegetable cover crop, and that's what starts to drive the soil system. And if you start looking at what's happening to things like worm numbers, you start to see the whole nutrient cycle start to function again. All it really needs at the moment is a little bit of moisture, with a lot of plants. And once you've got a lot of plants, any moisture you do receive from the rain is much better protected than areas where there's bare soil. So, you know, it's a matter.
Did you hear the quail?
No.
Hundreds of quail. Yeah, no, and that's okay. So that's my revelation. That's my next revelation. And I feel like after 10 years of growing and practicing growing, I suddenly feel like I might just start to be knowing how to work the system. And it's hilarious that it's as simple as inoculating the seeds, inoculating the soil with, you know, microbials as opposed to compost, and actually just doing massive cover cropping and keeping that cycle pulsing. You're upside down, Levi. So am I right, Daniel? I said in a post today that I'm really focused on a pulse, sort of on a pulse system. So that kind of, the pulse being the sun producing sap, feeding the soil system, that's a pulse. And then that sap being as exudate, being absorbed by multiple microbes and digested, and then that material then coming up into the plant. So you kind of got this daily cycle, and it sort of feels to me like it's so simple. How did we ever lose that information?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest, that we ever really knew as much as we'd like to think we knew. And I would like to put a point, I don't think we still know anywhere near as much as we think we know. It's such an incredibly complex world down there, all around us really, but, you know, particularly below our feet, that we just have no real true understanding of the complexities. You know, when you talk about there being, you know, in a teaspoon of soil, there are more organisms than are humans on the planet. in a single teaspoon. It's just the sheer volume of life that can exist below your feet is mind-boggling. It's and the fact that we just don't understand, and for so long we haven't had the ability. Well, for many years we didn't have the ability to even see most of that organism in the soil, and every day we're learning more about it. But it's more about the fact that understanding the power of nature to heal itself. Quite often we just have to get out of the way and stop screwing it up to let it actually repair. Hello, we've got the girls.
I just thought this
arrived.
was a perfect way to end.
Yes.
Is that these are really my best buddies. Who needs someone to hold the camera when you have these guys?
Walking, breathing, composting machines.
They are. They're looking a bit grumpy on it right now, but yeah.
I must say, I'm impressed how green that is, considering you've had no rain.
And also how fat they are, considering we've had not a lot of feed. So we, I guess, Daniel, I do give them I am kind of making the manure slightly more complex by giving them chicory and parsley and all of those weeds that we feed them. So that will be pulling more nutrition, right, into that end product called poos. Well,
you're improving their gut microflora, and that's going to naturally improve the outputs, the exudates, as you can refer to them. As part of the poop, they are essentially part of the poop cycle. They are a nutrient recycling machine. Very sweet. So no, absolutely, it's no different to our gut. I mean, the more diversity they have, I mean, if all they ever got to eat was kikuyu, they'd have a pretty boring existence.
Yeah.
Yeah. They come up every afternoon expecting a treat. So I guess she's so curious and gorgeous. I do love them quite a lot. Well, Levi, is there any comment that you would make, being that you have been here for been coming for a while? I mean, obviously it's not looking nearly as lush as normally it would to you, but what are your thoughts from your learnings?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that you just need to get. I mean, yeah, you're right. There's normally a lot more plants growing there, but I think getting plants growing everywhere is going to help get more trees in there, and get some stuff growing in your pathways.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do red clover. Just it grows really, really tall, but at the same time it is quite a really lovely mulch generator. You can chop it right back and it will grow back again. And again, you can almost grow it as a perennial red clover.
Nice. Well, thank you very much once again, Levi and Daniel, for your support for Sarah and in this conversation, and Sarah for taking us through the space there, and be 10 years down the track. It must be, I think, maybe just, I don't know, it'd be nice to sit in that as an accomplishment. So it's well done, and obviously it's generated a lot of even in yourself with as far as what you feel like you want to share and bring out into the community. So thank you for that. And I feel like there's a theme coming through after we're into the 8th session now, and we're all being challenged, whether we're day one, as we were with Sophie at the start, and now with you, Sarah, you're 10 years into this, and we're all being challenged by what to do next, and I think the sign that we're just how much of a journey and a process it is, and maybe we can get lost in the details, and there are some simple truths, but I'm not sure where I'm going with that. But I hope for people watching, we realise that we'll be learning every day, forever in a day. So yeah, thank you for sharing. And if anyone else any last comments? Silence. Wonderful. I will see. We'll see you all next week.
And the next Instagram takeover is Jessie Barnes from her beautiful project in Pororua. So that's going to be fantastic. She is has a compost. She's primarily a composting project that also has an urban farm beside it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing. And I think we're going to be meeting with her on Tuesday. Actually, we're looking at potentially doing these conversations before they do the Instagram takeover, as opposed to at the end. So I think that could also be really interesting for how that impacts on the Instagram takeover. It will be a sharing of learning as opposed to just a sharing of the space. So yeah, thank you very much for willing to play this adventure called Saving the Planet Through Growing Food.